brothers and sisters in Adam, welcome to this week's sermon, which is a continuation of my Cartography series, this time focusing on the Super Mutants of the Commonwealth. What can we learn about them based on where they are on the map? What could we find when we look at their population, as well as their named super mutant bosses? I want to explore these questions, as well as what we can learn about the Commonwealth super mutants based on their behavior and hierarchy. No matter how much you know about the super mutants in Fallout 4, there will be some new interesting things when looking at them from a bird's eye view. I also have my comment highlight at the end where I react to previous video comments, and if you enjoy my content, come join me on my Discord server. So, turn up the rads, my fellow rad lads, and let's look at our super mutant maps. I want to start by looking at the overall distribution of super mutants across the Commonwealth, before we get into some interesting details. I marked every area that super mutants can be found with red, and these areas are covering a generalized area of influence. That is to say, if you are in the red area, there is a good chance that a super mutant would spot you and engage. It shouldn't be all that surprising that downtown Boston seems to have more super mutant hotspots. It just makes sense that with more people, there are more things to scavenge, and more shelter would attract more creatures, human or otherwise. This distribution follows this leveling map from Bethesda quite well actually. Since super mutants are considered a higher level enemy, it makes sense that there are none in the lowest level areas of the map, which is the northwest corner where the player starts. The game tries to funnel the player towards Diamond City, and to do that, enemy levels in the direction of Diamond City are lower than directly south or east of the starting point. There are 3 groups of super mutants that can be encountered in the light blue areas, but all of them except for one are only encountered if the sole survivor enters a building. The Fraternal Post 115 and the CIT building are those 2 locations. Most players encounter super mutants for the first time when passing by the Brookline building area, where a small group of low-level super mutants are seen battling it out with Diamond City security forces. The rest of the super mutant locations are in the higher level areas, although it is interesting to note that there are no groups of super mutants in the most difficult areas of the map, the southern borders and the northeast area. There are 2 options here. One is from a game perspective, that super mutants are simply not seen as high-level enemies, and as such, are not given many locations in the most difficult portions of the map. An in-world option is that the super mutants are just not quite tough enough to colonize the high-threat areas, and therefore have to settle for areas that aren't saturated with extremely dangerous creatures. The issues with the first option, that super mutants from a game perspective are not seen as high-level enemies, is that the super mutants, like the super mutant Primus and super mutant Warlord, are more than capable of taking a ton of damage and seem like they would be easily considered a high-level enemy. Disregarding just normal super mutants entirely though, super mutant behemoths are just hands down the most dangerous of any super mutant variant in the entire game. So you would think that they would be found in high-level areas, but not quite. All the red Bs mark a spot where behemoths are scripted to appear or have a near 100% likelihood of spawning, and they just don't spawn readily in the most dangerous areas of the map. In fact, there are 2 behemoths that can spawn in the light blue area, which intuitively seems like the exact opposite of what you would expect. The issues with the second option, which is that super mutants are just not capable of facing off with more dangerous enemies, again comes back to the fact that behemoths are the most dangerous of all super mutant types, and not even they are typically found in these areas, which would seem to indicate that even they avoid the dangerous parts. Alright, now that we've seen that most super mutants are concentrated in the medium to medium high threat areas of the map, one very interesting area to look at is the Glowing Sea. A majority of the Glowing Sea is actually not considered a high threat level area, unlike the southeast and northeast. We can somewhat understand why the northeast and southeast areas don't have any super mutants, but why not the Glowing Sea? Although the Glowing Sea has heaps of background radiation even 200 years after the Great War, we know that super mutants are immune to radiation, so that wouldn't be an issue at all. In fact, they show that they are willing to make themselves at home around nuclear waste disposal sites. So, what could explain this? Well, this is where an important distinction needs to be considered when thinking of super mutants in Fallout 4 as a whole. We know that there are massive differences between the West Coast super mutants and the East Coast mutants, as Fallout 3 showed us hordes of extremely stupid and brutish super mutants that seem to focus solely on animalistic brutality and capturing humans to dip and perpetuate their race. And the super mutants in Fallout 4 are much more Raider-like. The now infamous Super Mutants orders, which can be found on the body of a super mutant raiding party, has the words kill, loot, return, and settlements will sometimes offer the sole survivor something in compensation for dealing with raiding super mutants. Super mutants can even be seen trying to successfully attack settlements that are owned by the player, and for these reasons, and more that we'll get into in a bit, super mutants are driven by the same needs that raiders are to attack for spoils and organize themselves in a way that helps accomplish that. In this light, it makes sense that they are not terribly interested in the glowing sea, because the only creatures that make that large, barren, irradiated wasteland home are ghouls, rad scorpions, and deathclaws. Also, let's not forget some of Adam's most devoted followers. This reason, more than anything, I believe, explains why they have chosen not to settle in the area, despite their ability to deal with radiation just fine. The 3 super mutant locations closest to the glowing sea are all within a short distance of other human settlements, whether they are raiders, gunners, or actual settlements. So I think it makes sense that we don't have any super mutants in the glowing sea. And personally, I prefer it that way myself. I like that the area has no organized groups of creatures, human or otherwise, because it makes it feel like a truly dangerous and desolate area of the Commonwealth. This is obviously excluding Virgil, since he is really only super mutant in appearance only. He doesn't act like a super mutant, and intentionally transformed himself to survive in the harsh environment, and therefore I am not including his cave on this map. It's one thing to know that this is how super mutant groups can be found across the Commonwealth, but it is an entirely different endeavor to ask if this distribution makes the most sense. From a pure game standpoint, it does make sense that super mutants are not found in the lowest level areas. They are, after all, not low level enemies. It also makes sense that they don't seem fond of settling down in the glowing sea, since they are essentially raiders, and the glowing sea is meant to be a supremely uncivilized and savage place. We can reasonably assume their absence in the northeast and southeast because there are higher level enemies there. Although if we are operating on pure game logic, then we might suppose that this is where we would see some super mutant behemoths, but that's simply not the case. So pure game logic is not the sole driver of why we find super mutants where we do. One question I want to ask and investigate, however, is that since we know exactly how and where the super mutants come from, does this distribution make sense in that context? Let me explain with a little bit of backstory. It is no mystery where the Commonwealth super mutants come from. Progress far enough along in the main quest and you will find out after not too long that the Commonwealth super mutants owe their existence to the Institute. The sole source of mutants is sequestered away, buried underneath heaps of rock and stone beneath the current CIT building, with only 2 known ways in and out. The most obvious way is the molecular relay, or teleporter, that allows some personnel to get to the surface. The other way is a little-known path that is only accessible when ending the game with the Minutemen, where they are able to access some old tunnels and passageways that eventually lead to the Institute. The Institute themselves do not seem to be aware of this passage though, and from what I can gather, they seem to think the only way in or out is via the molecular relay. With that information, I think it is safe to assume that as the Institute was conducting its FEV research, creating super mutants, and then tagging and discarding them above, they did so using the teleporter. Now this is where my question comes in. Since the teleporter uses up a lot of very precious energy, which the Institute by 2287 is desperately trying to change so that they have more energy security, would it make sense that the Institute would transport super mutants relatively close so as to use the least amount of energy possible. It isn't stated definitively that the greater the distance, the more energy is required, but we do know that there are limits on the absolute distance of the relay, and thinking through things logically, work is a force applied over distance, so the relay would have to perform more work to go farther. And I know I'm probably shooting myself in the foot by applying actual logic to the world of Fallout, but in the absence of any other information, I think it is most logical to fall back on real-world logic. So if we assumed the Institute would transport the mutants not far as to save energy, then the new super mutants would likely appear not too far from where the Institute can be found, within a fairly small radius, maybe, I don't know, something like this. It would then follow that we might see a larger concentration of super mutants not far from the areas that they would be spawned into. This can be because it is more convenient to set up shop close by, or super mutants could have learned themselves that every once in a while, new mutants will randomly show up in and around this area. And since the Institute is the only way that super mutants can increase their numbers in the Commonwealth, if they want more fighters to bolster their ranks and raiding ventures, they would be keenly interested in scooping up any new mutants. If super mutants acted at all tribalistic, then there could be groups that would compete to claim the new super mutants, which would mean that even more super mutants would be scattered around this area, on constant lookout. We will actually deduce later in this video the way that super mutants operate, since we have already established that they are functionally the same as raiders, and we know that raider groups factionalize very easily, and command loyalty through intimidation and fear to the group leader. So while this scenario I just painted relies on a number of assumptions, it essentially boils down to this. Could the distribution of mutants be affected by where the Institute decides to discard their little science projects? If that is the case, then it would seem downtown Boston might be the general target, even though the city does a good job at attracting large groups anyway because of all the shelter and resources. This was more of a thought question than actually trying to come up with an answer, although it would have been really cool if people in the Commonwealth knew, through rumors, that a certain part of the Commonwealth should be avoided because it seems to generate super mutants from thin air. It also would have been good foreshadowing for the plot twist that the Institute is buried and accessible only via a futuristic teleporter. So we looked at the overall distribution of places where the sole survivor can run into super mutants in the Commonwealth circa 2287. But let's look at things a different way. Here is a population distribution of super mutants across the Commonwealth. The numbers are derived from my own investigations of going to each of these areas and counting super mutants only, no super mutant hounds. The number of super mutants can vary game to game based on a number of factors, and since my numbers have a sample size of only 1 per location, your mileage will vary. However, I'm less interested in the absolute numbers because I don't have the time or desire to investigate each location several times to try and get a good average, and I'm more interested in the relative difference between the locations. I try to make it simple by using multiples of 5 and numbers with a plus just to note that they could have up to 4 more mutants in that location. So a 5 plus could be 6 to 9, but a 5 is exactly 5. I didn't think the differences fewer than 5 merited much attention since we really are only interested in substantial relative differences. The only other thing that I will add is that this count also includes any dead super mutant bodies that spawned in areas where the location is an active combat zone, since those bodies are often static and would count towards the overall super mutant population if they hadn't just been killed. I also combine areas that are super close together. Like here, I combine the populations of Shaw High School, West Roxbury Station, and the Fallon's Department Store super mutant populations because they are all adjacent to each other, and the super close proximity most likely means that they are all part of the same group. Alright, so I hope this wasn't a huge surprise to anyone, but the downtown area, specifically the Trinity Plaza area, has far and away the most super mutants. This area has 4 close by locations that all contribute to this very high number. The Wilson Automatoys headquarters, Trinity Tower, Trinity Church, and the Boston Public Library. Trinity Tower is home to a named super mutant, one that we will talk about when we start to look at the specific super mutants that we know about, which admittedly aren't many, but his name is Fist. Fist seems to command a large number of super mutants in the tower itself, and I would argue also the other super mutants found in the close by locations. Although the Trinity Church only has a couple super mutants, there is a very large number that can spawn in the Boston Public Library, and the underground portions as well. This is because they are mounting a massive assault on the library, which is heavily guarded by a host of protectrons and machine gun turrets. We will get into location specifics a bit later, but I suppose it makes some sense that such a huge concentration of mutants can be found almost smack dab in the middle of downtown Boston, because it is also home to the largest settlements and groups. If you recall, the largest raider group by population, as well as by area, was Bosco's group, which shares a border with the area controlled by the Super Mutants. Diamond City and Goodneighbor are also the two largest settlements in the Commonwealth, so this wealth of potential targets seems like it would attract a large number of predatory beings. The second largest group is the Fallon's department store area, where Super Mutants have come to control the West Roxbury Metro and Shaw High School as well, south of downtown Boston. The third largest concentration is found at the Medford Memorial Hospital, well north of Boston, and is in fact the second most northerly location that Super Mutants control. This high number of Super Mutants is quite interesting because the surrounding Super Mutant locations have actually only been very recently taken, but we will also get to that a little later. As far as sheer population goes, the southwest portion of the map has the fewest mutants, and that is not because of the glowing sea, but what few locations they can be found at, they just don't have high populations. At first I thought this was a bit strange, but I think it has a rather simple explanation. Just like how the glowing sea area is shunned by super muties because of the lack of raidable targets, I think this area has the lowest super mutant population because the number of settlers and raiders in this area is just really low. Using my raider map, the green circles are generic raiders, the blue dots are gunners, and the colored circles are specific raider groups, for example the Rust Devils. This area is just sparse when compared to, for example, the Northwest, which has plenty of settlements, raiders, and more. So I would surmise just a lack of targets in this area keeps the overall super mutant population low. I would be interested in any insights that any of you can glean from this information, and if you see something that I missed and you think should get more attention, please tell me in the comments and let's get some discussion going. So we know where we can find mutants and approximately how many can be found in each location, but I think it's important to consider the areas that are in a state of flux. That is to say, are there areas that are currently a combat zone and being contested by some other group? Luckily for us, the answer to that is yes. And here are those areas marked in purple. They are concentrated solely in the downtown Boston area and the southwest, so we can just zoom in on this area to get a better look. Let's start on the east and work our way west and look at these individually. The Super Mutants control an area in downtown Boston known as Hub 360, which is a tall skyscraper that has an abundance of Super Mutants, around 15 by my count. The Super Mutants, in addition to controlling the tower, have spilled out onto the Fallen Skybridge area, which is an elevated highway where some elevated pedestrian crossings have fallen from adjacent buildings to the highway, which allows for people to move from one building to the highway onto another building. One such structure is the so-called ruined skyscraper, otherwise known as Pinnacle High Rise, that is controlled by an outfit of gunners. The Super Mutants have launched an attack from the skybridge and are attacking the gunners, starting at the higher floors and working down to the base. Now, I'm only a casual Star Wars fan, but if the prequels taught me anything, it's that you want the high ground. I don't know if we can say with any certainty which side will win, but the fact that the Super Mutants control their skyscraper, the skybridge, and are invading the top floors of the ruined skyscraper could indicate that they have what it takes, but both sides have taken considerable casualties. There is definitely a chance that the Super Mutants can eventually occupy both of the skyscrapers and strengthen their footprint in downtown Boston. But they could very easily also be repulsed by the Gunners, who themselves are very formidable fighters. So it's difficult to draw a conclusion as to the outcome of this conflict. The Brookline building area we spoke of earlier, because it is often the first time players will encounter super mutants on their way to follow the main quest and discover Diamond City, is our next target. Diamond City security is in the middle of a battle with super mutants, and if the player just observes the battle without interfering, Diamond City security will eventually kill all the mutants by themselves, which was around 6 on my last playthrough. So I think it's safe to say that this small area that is being controlled by a handful of super mutants is doomed to be destroyed by Diamond City security. South of the Brookline building is the Fens Cafe and Parkview Apartments, which showcase a battle between raiders and super mutants that is currently raging. The super mutants have apparently killed their way through one apartment building and are currently fighting on the roof with a group of raiders. I would say, given the body count of 1 super mutant to 8 raiders, that the raiders are pretty heavily outmatched, and this will most likely result in the super mutants wiping the raiders out of the Parkview Apartments completely. So I would mark this as a win for the super mutants. Just north in the ruins of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology building, a battle is raging between super mutants and Gen 1 synths. This battle isn't quite as lopsided as the battle at the Brookline building with Diamond City security, but the synths do seem to eke out a win in this battle if the player does not interfere. Now I find this battle interesting because of its location. The ruins of CIT are not connected to the Institute proper. Again, like I mentioned before, there are only 2 known ways in and out. But despite this, the Institute seems keen to keep a group of super mutants from setting up shop in the ruins of the CIT. Honestly, of all the groups that could settle in the area, I would think super mutants would be the least of the Institute's worries. They do not have the intelligence to notice any clues or indications that the Institute is nearby, buried deep in the ground. In fact, I think it might be beneficial, as an ignorant group of super mutants setting up shop in the CIT ruins would keep scavengers and other humans that may stumble upon some compromising information away. I just feel like if the Institute sends synths after any group that tries to settle there, people will eventually clue into the fact that the Institute is somehow tied to this location, because they just keep attacking anyone that tries to settle there with extreme prejudice. But it is safe to say that the super mutants will not last long in this location, even if they get lucky and win this particular battle. The last contested area is Natick Banks, and the super mutants there are getting whooped. They share a border with a rival raider group that occupies the north part of Natick Banks, but that isn't what is dooming the super mutants here. No, it is a particularly pissed off Deathclaw that by the time the sole survivor makes it to the super mutant camp is in the middle of massacring all the mutants. Several dead bodies are laying around, and if the player does not intervene, the Deathclaw will continue to finish off the other mutants. It is certain that this group of super mutants will be wiped out, decreasing the number of locations held by super mutants in this area even more. They didn't have many locations or a high population of super mutants here to begin with, and maybe this Deathclaw attack is a small glimpse into why the super mutants stay away from the glowing sea. So it appears that there are some super mutant locations that will be lost to outside forces. But what small places they will lose, they have recently gained tenfold. There are 4 locations that are confirmed to be rather recent acquisitions, either due to fresh raider or settler bodies just being strewn about, or because of notes or messages that say as much. Let's start in the south, just south of downtown Boston. Fallon's department store is a very large building that has a bunch of super mutants and is close to the West Roxbury Station and Shaw High School, which are also controlled by super mutants. There are many fresh raider bodies that can be found all over, indicating that the super mutants killed off the previous raider occupiers not too long ago. Raider bodies are not found in the Shaw High School or the metro area, so it is possible that the super mutants moved into those locations, and eventually mounted a successful assault on the department store. They leave Milton General Hospital to the north alone, maybe because of the robots that defend the hospital, as well as the parking garage, which is some sort of lethal puzzle maze. If the super mutants are able to take the hospital, it would provide even more shelter and resources from which they can raid surrounding settlements or expand further. Big John Salvage is a junkyard to the north, but still outside of downtown Boston. It is also littered with a number of raider bodies, more than what we normally see if a super mutant group is just taking prisoners, like at the Medford Memorial Hospital. This seems to indicate that super mutants successfully took this position from a group of raiders and have been able to claim it for their own, given their relatively close proximity to the large group of super mutants that are in the Trinity Plaza area. Assuming that there is some sort of connection between the two isn't unreasonable, but unfortunately, we just have no other information relating to the group of super mutants here. The other recent super mutant acquisitions are in the northwest, and let's take a look at one such location, Breakheart Banks. This was a decent-sized settlement with only a small number of settlers who were tending crops before they were massacred by super mutants. There are actually very few super mutants here. I only counted 3 on my most recent game. The bodies of the settlers attest to the recent battle that took place here, and if you need more convincing, the map marker is that of a settlement rather than a normal location marker that we see with every other super mutant location. This is the northernmost super mutant outpost, and could indicate efforts to push farther north where there are several raider locations and settlements that could be raided. The last area that was recently acquired is very interesting, and that is why I saved it for last. It was held by a group of raiders that were attacked by super mutants, led by one of the few named super mutant leaders that we know of, Hammer. We can recover a holotape that one of the human defenders helped Hammer record. In the recording, Hammer gives a status update to Fist, the leader of the Trinity Tower super mutants. Now that's interesting. In the report, Hammer tells Fist that they found a good place with walls and water, along with a bunker with a bunch of stuff inside. Hammer asks Fist to trade him in exchange for weapons that Hammer recovered at the new location. He is asking for Fist to send more people so that they can raid more. I can only assume by people he is meaning more super mutants, and this really shows an interesting dynamic. Before we really get into that though, let's just sum up what we can gather from the recent super mutant acquisitions. In the south, they appear to be expanding within this large area south of Boston that was previously suspiciously devoid of any super mutants. Up north, they are making progress establishing themselves in this area, establishing the northernmost location and taking the large area of West Everett Estates. What I find so peculiar about this though is that the Medford Hospital is just north of the estates and has one of the highest concentrations of super mutants for any single location. Yet Hammer had to be sent to take the estates by Fist all the way down in Boston. Perhaps the super mutants at the hospital are responsible for taking Breakheart Banks though, because they are the closest established location. These recent successful takeovers could indicate a shift to the north for super mutants as they continue to look for soft targets to raid. So, talking about Hammer was a good segue to the next thing I wanted to look at, which are the unique super mutant groups scattered throughout the Commonwealth. Similar to the Raider video where I mapped out the locations of all Raider groups and their respective bosses, I mapped out the few groups of super mutants where we have a named boss leading them. Let's start with what I consider to be the most powerful of all the super mutant leaders, and that is Fist in downtown Boston. Again, Fist controls Trinity Tower, the tallest building in all of Boston, and is adjacent to other places infested with super mutants, namely Trinity Church, the Public Library, and Wilson Automatoys headquarters. And due to their proximity, I'm considering them all one group. We also established that Hammer, up at the West Everett Estates, sees Fist as his leader, as he reports his successful takeover of the estates and tries to coordinate a trade of weapons for more super mutants to help with further raids. This shows a form of fealty between Fist and Hammer, and may shed light on the way that the Commonwealth super mutant hierarchy works. The process of Hammer being given control of a group of mutants with the objective of waging battle against others for control of land and resources may be compared to what is called cooperative warlord politics. It is obvious that Hammer isn't completely subordinate to Fist, since Hammer tries to coordinate a trade of weapons for more mutants, rather than just considering all the spoils as immediately the property of Fist. Another very important observation that helps us understand how the super mutants work is that they are never seen fighting amongst themselves. Whereas raiders will readily fight other raiders and try and take their territory, super mutants are never spoken of in fighting or seen engaging in turf wars with one another. This seems to indicate that they all have a strong sense of loyalty among their kind, and perhaps some sort of peaceful connection amongst all the close-by super mutant groups. On the face of it, it seems somewhat contradictory that a group whose only intent is to raid other groups for supplies would not have problems with competition from fellow super mutants. However, there is a key difference between humans and super mutants in Fallout 4. Commonwealth super mutants have no way to increase their population on purpose. Their numbers are completely dependent on the Institute dumping their failed experiments on the surface, and with the destruction of the FEV lab at the hands of Virgil, there is no new blood to bolster the super mutant ranks. Perhaps they understand this predicament, and therefore know that cooperation must take precedence above all else, lest their numbers become increasingly scarce through normal attrition as well as what would be mutant-on-mutant violence. Regardless of the reason, we learn from Hammer's victory over the raiders at the estates that there is at least some sort of hierarchy. Within this power structure, the leader gives orders to take territory and will then coordinate trade of weapons and resources for more super mutants. This is honestly more in-depth and interesting than super mutants in the Capital Wasteland. Another indication that super mutants operate within some sort of cooperative warlord system is that the highest level super mutant variants are called super mutant warlords, which have the highest damage resistance and most HP of any variant excepting epic and ancient behemoths. Another named super mutant is Big Mac, who leads the super mutants at the southernmost location, the Wilson Automatoys factory. Actually, what is with super mutants and toys? They occupy both the factory and the headquarters. Weird. Anyway, we are not given any real information related to Big Mac, and we don't know of any relations with any other group. So unfortunately, we don't learn much here. We do get some extra interesting information from the last named super mutant boss, however, the mutant known as Deadeye from the Fraternal Post 115. This is a location that is on the way to Diamond City, and the closest to the starting area, so it can be the first time players encounter super mutants, if they are carefully exploring along the way. Deadeye is interesting, because he has not one but two dead eyes, so to speak, or to translate from super mutant to human, he's blind. When the player goes into the building, Deadeye can be seen sitting on a stage all by himself. He cannot see the player, so generally the player can get pretty close and observe that he is sitting there listening to Diamond City radio. That is peculiar behavior, simply because super mutants usually show disdain for most things human. However, if Deadeye hears the player approach, he will go to a switch and throw it, causing an alarm to go off and a bunch of super mutants to pile in to fight the player. The reason this is so interesting is because it really shows the amount of loyalty that these super mutants have for their leaders. In a situation where their boss is blind and therefore would be extremely easy to kill for any aspiring super mutant leader, since you could just pop a cap into his blind head and claim the gang as your own. But no, they set up an elaborate system that allows Deadeye's subordinates to be notified of any threat and come in to defend their leader. Say what you want about super mutants, but that is some serious loyalty. There are no known connections of this group to any other, although their close proximity to the Super Mutants seen battling synths in the CIT building could indicate some sort of connection, although that is just an assumption. A Super Mutant's identity is so important that when Strong, a potential Super Mutant companion, starts to listen to Rex Goodman and desire what he calls the milk of human kindness in order to become successful like humans, he is put into the holding cell along with Rex. If the Soul Survivor rescues Rex and Strong will be able to become a companion, but his dialogue will reinforce his belief that super mutants are superior to humans and destined to kill all the things on the Earth. The innate loyalty of super mutants is also shown when the Soul Survivor maxes out Strong's affinity, and Strong specifically decides to give his allegiance to the Soul Survivor, calling him his leader. This extreme loyalty may be what motivates some super mutants to become suiciders, blowing themselves up with a mini nuke in the ongoing pursuit of victory. This practice, though, would seem counterproductive due to the aforementioned limited population and no real way to actually make new super mutants. Super mutant behemoths seem to operate completely outside of any power structure, but are not seen attacking other super mutants, so there must be some level of respect. There is only one known instance of behemoths working with other super mutants, and that is in Far Harbor, where a behemoth known as Groon led a number of super mutants to the Far Harbor Island and settled at the Vim Pop factory there. However, in the Commonwealth, there is no such coordination going on, unless super mutants just follow behind behemoths as they wreck their way through the Commonwealth, using them as some sort of trailblazer. But again, this is just me talking. The last order of business is to talk about the interesting information related to some of these locations. Starting up north, Breakheart Banks is associated with 3 super mutant related quests: Greenskins, Kidnapping, and Hypothesis. Greenskins is a radiant quest that settlements will give the Soul Survivor, wherein they ask the player to take out a group of super mutants that have been attacking and trying to raid their settlement. The presence of this quest here means that the super mutants are active in raiding nearby settlements, like perhaps the Slog or Greentop Nursery, which are close by. They are also associated with kidnapping quests, meaning that they are actively taking prisoners, either to dismember and eat or for whatever other purposes. The Hypothesis quest is an Institute one, where the player is tasked with taking out a super mutant leader and obtaining a flesh sample that can be returned for study. One note about the Greenskins quest that I think is quite interesting is that the Soul Survivor needs to only kill the marked super mutant in order to complete the quest. This stands in contrast to the Radiant quests related to wiping out raider groups, since those require all the raiders to be killed in order to complete the quest. This would seem to imply that killing the leader of the super mutants is all that is required to make the group non-functional. This may be due to the observed hyper-loyalty to leaders, and the mere act of taking out the leader is enough to make coordinated raiding efforts non-viable. Or perhaps it causes a complete dissolution of the group as a whole. We can't know for sure, but this definitely speaks to the culture of super mutants and how it contrasts with human raiders. Medford Hospital just south also has the Greenskins, Hypothesis, and Kidnapping quests associated with them, and the body of a dead raider can be found in a holding room where the presumed leader resides. The West Everett estates are not associated with any quests, maybe because they're waiting for reinforcements from Fist. And out east, there is a group at the Revere Satellite Array that are associated with the Greenskins quests only. South and east a bit is Fort Strong, which has a behemoth that will spawn when taking the area for the Brotherhood, but is otherwise not associated with any other quests. Moving west, an unmarked location called Long Wharf has a small group of mutants that have the Greenskins quest, and I just find this interesting, have defensive outposts on the water's edge overlooking the water, but nothing facing towards the shore, which is the direction any overland threat would come from in order to challenge them. Do we chalk this up to dumb mutants, or are they more concerned about something in the water? West to Faneuil Hall, in Boston proper, we have Greenskins, Hypothesis, and Kidnapping, along with a hefty host of super mutants ready for a fight. Go west a bit more and you come to the so-called Cambridge construction site, where the mutants there are only associated with the Greenskins quest. South and west are the mutants at the CIT building fighting the synths, and they have no quests. And west a bit more is the Fraternal Order 115 with Deadeye and his group. They are only associated with the Hypothesis quest and nothing else. Let's keep heading west to the Weston Water Treatment Plant, where a small group of super mutants that aren't associated with any quests can be found. South to Natick Banks, the super mutants are too busy getting deathclawed to be a menace to anyone, and no quests are associated with them. A small group of mutants reside at the mass fusion disposal site with only the Hypothesis quest. Again, it's interesting that none of these southwest groups appear to really be raiding or kidnapping, because I guess who would they kidnap and where would they go to raid if there aren't really any settlements nearby? The Scrap Palace is south and east, and although they are few in number, are quite high level compared to surrounding groups. They are also associated with Greenskins, Hypothesis, and kidnapping quests, the first of these western groups to actually be confirmed to raid and kidnap. Just north is the Coast Guard Pier, with another rather small group of mutants, but also have the Greenskins, Hypothesis, and kidnapping quests. Out east, we have our large group at Fallon's department store that are associated with the Greenskins and Hypothesis quests, a large group at the West Roxbury Metro Station that only have Hypothesis, and then just a few that occupy the Shaw High School, who are associated with Greenskins, Hypothesis, and kidnapping. In fact, the mutants here have gone the extra step of trying to lure humans by forcing a previous captive to record a message that is broadcast on a ham radio. It asks for help from, specifically, other humans, and is obvious from the audio that it is a trap, as the captive is obviously under duress, and the super mutant can be heard speaking to the captive. Southeast is Big Mac's group at the Automatoys factory, and this location is tied to Greenskins, Hypothesis, and Reclamation. Reclamation is an Institute Radiant quest where the player is tasked with finding a synth that was taken hostage. They are to clear the hostiles and give the synth a transmitter to allow a courier to come and reclaim the synth. This would imply that Big Mac has, probably accidentally, taken a synth as a hostage. Almost directly north is Big John Salvage, which is related to Hypothesis, kidnapping, and the Diamond City's Most Wanted quests, and also has some rather high-level super mutants compared to other locations. This is the only location where Diamond City has a reward for killing a super mutant leader. East is the Gwinnett restaurant that has both Greenskins and Hypothesis quests, and a serious Mirelurk problem. Just north is an unmarked construction site with a few super mutants and no related quests. North again is Hub 360 and the Fallen Skybridge, that once again have no quests except for Hypothesis, which may have something to do with their battle with the gunners over the ruined skyscraper. Out west, looking at the area with the most mutants in the whole Commonwealth, the Wilson Automatoys HQ is linked to the kidnapping and Hypothesis quests. Trinity Tower, where Fist is holding Rex and Strong captive, has no quests except for Curtain Call, which is the quest to rescue Rex. This is a somewhat elaborate trap on the part of Fist to lure in more humans, and again, shows a higher level of thinking that the Commonwealth Soups have over their counterparts in the Capital Wasteland. Trinity Church and the Boston Public Library both lack any super mutant specific quests, which is honestly very surprising, but the library is perhaps the most understandable since it is not controlled by the super mutants. It is merely under assault by them. Next we have the Parkview Apartments and Fence Cafe, a bit west with the kidnapping and Hypothesis quests. The last area is the small Brookline building where the standoff between Diamond Security is taking place, and there once again are no quests attached to the mutants in this location. Super mutants have a few random encounters that reinforce the raiding and kidnapping that they are said to be doing in many of these locations. One encounter is several mutants escorting a human prisoner, which can be freed by the sole survivor. Another is a raiding party that can be encountered by the sole survivor, with the leader bearing the infamous Kill, Loot, Return note. There is one last random encounter that shows super mutants facing off against some raiders, which is to be expected should those two groups meet. finally, settlements under the player's control can and will be attacked by groups of super mutants, even settlements far away from any super mutant location, like for instance Sanctuary, which shows a willingness to travel far if they think there are promises of great reward. So the last part I wanted to cover, if only briefly, is what I think the ultimate fate of these super mutant groups are, and how this map would change depending on which ending the player chooses. To preface this, I think that no matter what the ending ends up being, that the super mutant days in the Commonwealth are numbered. Without the Institute to continue to create new mutants to dump on the surface, their population will inevitably decline until they are extinct, barring some drastic and unforeseeable event. That said, I think whoever is in charge at the end of the Fallout 4 main quest will have an effect on where super mutants will be targeted and wiped out, and ultimately how long it will take for them to be considered extinct. Should the Brotherhood be the dominant power in the Commonwealth, I think this one is the most straightforward. With their extreme hatred for super mutants and very effective ability to wage combat, once they have dealt with the synth menace, they would likely turn their attention towards other dangerous and hostile groups like the super mutants. The Brotherhood is already engaged in campaigns against the super mutants, as is evidenced by the cleansing the Commonwealth and leading by example Radiant quests, which often tasks the sole survivor with taking out a super mutant stronghold in the name of ridding the wasteland of dangerous creatures. They would quickly and decisively begin to attack super mutant locations with only one purpose in mind: eradication. The largest and closest locations would be targeted first, and the super mutants would have no option but to die or flee from the Commonwealth. This scenario would likely be the quickest and most absolute in terms of seeing the end of super mutants in the Commonwealth. The Minutemen would probably be the next most efficient at eliminating the super mutant threat. While not nearly as capable or organized as the Brotherhood, the Minutemen don't have any love for super mutants and recognize the threat that they pose. Hence the Radiant quest Greenskins, which specifically targets super mutants. However, the Minutemen seem to only be concerned with groups of super mutants that threaten settlements. So any group of super mutants that live on the periphery of the map and do not pose a threat to settlements would probably be left alone. For example, there are few settlements on the western border, so it is possible some super mutants could take refuge there and battle it out with any nearby raiders for resources. So, should the Minutemen win, I think they would also target the large and prominent super mutant locations that are the most threatening. Although they may struggle to defeat super mutants as easily as the Brotherhood, they would definitely be victorious, even if it took them longer. But since they don't have an ideological hatred for super mutants, as long as the mutants were pushed far enough away to not threaten any settlements, there could be small groups that exist as they continue to lose members and slowly go extinct due to natural attrition. Now the last two factions are where it gets interesting, because they don't have any Radiant quests that specifically target super mutants and don't have a hard ideological stance against their existence, so things aren't as straightforward. The Railroad would most likely be the next group that would accelerate the destruction of the super mutant race. The Railroad seems the most concerned with groups that threaten their main purpose, which is to protect and help synths. Should the super mutants pose a threat to that mission, then the Railroad would likely launch a campaign against the groups of mutants that are posing a danger, but otherwise would likely devote their resources elsewhere as needed. Due to this, I can see the larger and more central groups of super mutants being taken out, especially in and around the areas that the Railroad operates, like its headquarters and safe houses. Any other place close to large settlements where super mutants may try and raid or kidnap may also be targeted by the Railroad, but there would definitely be more super mutant locations scattered throughout the Commonwealth, threatening settlements that, if the Minutemen or Brotherhood were in charge, would otherwise not exist. Now the Institute ending, I think, is the least certain and in many ways could be the most variable of the bunch. The Institute, at a time, was heavily invested in FEV research, and even as that interest waned as the synthetic organics became successful, it wasn't until Brian Virgil sabotaged the lab that the Institute finally stopped creating new super mutants. I haven't seen anything that would lead me to believe that the Institute is interested in rebooting their program, so I do think that there is no way for there to be new super mutant blood. The Institute, however, is interested in what research they can glean from the existing super mutants, as is obvious by the Hypothesis quest, where they want some flesh samples from super mutants. The Institute otherwise doesn't care about them, and in fact, the super mutants may serve to convince the people of the Commonwealth that they need the security that only the Institute can provide because the grassroots Minutemen and all other factions are destroyed or defunct. For this reason, if the Institute isn't charged by the end of the game, I see the super mutants going extinct at the slowest rate of all other options, due to a combination of ambivalence on the part of the Institute and some passing interest in studying the super mutants. I would expect the super mutant numbers to dwindle slowly in numbers due to natural attrition and death that comes with the Raider life. So the super mutants are likely to stick around a good deal longer in this scenario, with the smallest outposts dying off first, leaving the biggest to survive a little longer. That is it for this analysis. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts. What do you agree with and what do you disagree with? Is there any interesting aspect that I failed to address or an important aspect I failed to include in my analysis? I really liked the discussion that was generated by my Raider video and would love to see that same level of input here, because whether you agree with the presence of super mutants or not in Fallout 4, they were different enough to make them interesting. I am not done with the entire video though, since I have my comment highlights, but first, once again I am thanking my wonderful patrons for going beyond the call of duty and supporting me. If you would like to join the few and proud displayed here, I have my Patreon link in my video description. If you want to discuss this video or anything Fallout related, come to my Discord, and let's have a good chat. On to the comments from my Fallout Bible Installment 5 video. Ryan Bush mentioned that the steam trucks, mentioned by Chris Avalone, that the super mutants apparently have, could have been old tractors or trains. And I think somewhere steam tractors are actually specifically mentioned. Truthfully, if we are thinking of a post-atomic age wasteland, steam-powered machinery is not that unrealistic, since a hunk of radioactive material could be used to heat water and generate steam, making for a basic but universe-realistic way to harness energy. Steve Ryman brought up a point that I hadn't considered from the first Fallout. There's a skeleton of an unfortunate Vault 13 dweller, Ed, who died right outside the vault door. Chris mentions it being a sign that the world is very dangerous, but Steve here saw it as foreshadowing, since no matter what the Vault Dweller does for Vault 13, saving them by getting a water chip and later being invaded by super mutants, they don't allow you to come back in, and Ed foreshadowed that by being a Vault Dweller that wasn't let back in. I never thought about that, but I like it. Average Forza player brought up YouTube Shorts, since some of this information could be presented in such a format. I know shorts can be a divisive subject, and I have yet to make any, but there are a few small interesting factoids that are nowhere near long enough for a video, but could be easily condensed into a short in a satisfying way. So if I do decide to make some, you are obviously not obliged to watch something you don't want, but I would want it to be novel and interesting information, and it also wouldn't cut into my video material. Jeremy Nicholson brought up a great point, stating that he didn't know how the Enclave didn't know about the Master, since the Master integrated itself with both the Mariposa military base's mainframe, as well as the Vault network in the Boneyard, and the Enclave purport to be monitoring those networks. I got nothing. What do you guys think? Mordred made me laugh with this comment. No, you see, the Fallout timeline diverges from the Metal Gear Solid timeline, not our own. The divergence point is whether war changes or not. That is fantastic. It is time for me to make a Fallout vs Metal Gear Solid video. I won't go over any specific comments from my video about YouTube and their enforcement policies, because I essentially said what I needed to and am more interested in talking about Fallout, since, that's kind of the whole point of this channel. I just wanted to express my thanks to everyone that showed support. You guys buoy my spirits and help put things in perspective. And so we come to a close, my dear rad friends. Remember that in Atom, all things are possible. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you soon.